I didn't say a word when Martha Hendricks, the HOA president, slammed her manicured fist on the conference table and declared my gravel driveway a neighborhood eyesore that violated every aesthetic standard in our community covenant. I just reached into my leather portfolio, pulled out the Federal Highway Administration certification and the Army Corps of Engineers contract specifications, and watched her face go from righteous indignation to confused silence. Her lawyer, some fresh-faced kid in a $1,000 suit, leaned over to read the documents, and I watched the color drain from his cheeks like someone had opened a valve. 23 years building roads in places where one wrong calculation meant soldiers died. These people thought they could lecture me about proper aggregate grading and drainage systems. Before all this nonsense started, life was exactly what I'd hoped for when I retired from the Army. After 2 decades of deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and half a dozen other places that don't make the evening news, I'd bought a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Ridge. Drive in what the real estate agent called a quiet, well-maintained community with reasonable HOA guidelines. The house came with 2 acres of land, including a long driveway that wound through some mature oak trees before opening up to a circular drive in front of the house. The previous owner had maintained it with basic gravel, nothing fancy. Just good crushed stone that drained well and didn't wash out in heavy rain. I loved the sound of tires on gravel when I pulled in after grocery runs or fishing trips. It reminded me of my grandfather's farm in Nebraska, where I'd spent summers as a kid learning that some of the best things in life were simple and practical. My daily routine was blissfully unremarkable. I'd wake up around 6, make coffee on the back patio while watching deer wander through the trees, then spend my mornings working in the garage workshop I'd set up for woodworking projects. Afternoons were for reading military history or driving to the lake about 20 minutes away to fish for bass. I wasn't trying to impress anyone or make any statements. I just wanted a quiet place to decompress from decades of military life. Somewhere I could fix things with my hands and not worry about politics or protocol or people trying to tell me how to live. The neighbors seemed friendly enough we'd wave when we passed on our evening walks, exchange pleasantries about the weather, keep our properties neat without being obsessive about it. It felt like the kind of place where you could age gracefully. Without drama, the first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in October when I found a bright yellow violation notice zip-tied to my mailbox post. The letter, printed on official Maple Ridge Homeowners Association letterhead, informed me that my unpermitted gravel driveway surface was in direct violation of Section 4.7 of the Community Covenant, which required all driveways to be constructed of aesthetically appropriate materials such as concrete, asphalt, or decorative pavers. I was being fined $200 and given 30 days to bring my property into compliance or face escalating penalties. I read the letter 3 times, standing there in my bathrobe with my coffee getting cold, trying to process the absurdity of it. The driveway had been there when I bought the house. It was mentioned in the property description. The home inspector had specifically noted that it was in excellent condition with proper drainage and crown maintenance. I spent that afternoon digging through my closing documents and found the original property survey from 1987, which clearly showed the gravel driveway as an existing feature. The home inspection report praised its condition and noted that it appeared to be professionally installed with proper base preparation and drainage considerations. I also found something interesting in the HOA zone. Architectural guidelines, a grandfather clause, stating that any existing landscaping or hardscaping features that predated the current covenants would be considered compliant as long as they were maintained in good repair. My driveway wasn't just legal, it was explicitly protected. I drafted a polite email to the HOA board, attached copies of all relevant documents, and explained that my driveway was grandfathered and properly maintained. I even included photos, showing that it was in better condition than several of the concrete driveways in the neighborhood that had developed cracks and staining. The response I received 2 weeks later was not what I expected. Instead of an acknowledgement of their mistake, I got a form letter from Martha Hendricks stating that grandfathered features must still meet current aesthetic standards and that gravel driveways create dust, noise, and visual pollution that negatively impact property values. The fine was increased to $500. and I was warned that continued noncompliance would result in the HOA placing a lien against my property. The letter suggested I contact their preferred contractors for estimates on driveway replacement, and helpfully included a list of companies owned by 3 different HOA board members. I stared at that letter for a long time, feeling something cold and familiar settling in my chest. The same methodical calm that used to come over me when I had to explain to some officious supply officer why his interpretation of military regulations was going to get people killed. That night, I called my old unit commander, now working as a civilian contractor for the Department of Transportation. After I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before he started laughing. "Know what you need to do," he said. "Pull the engineering specs. Pull everything." He's right. I'd spent my entire career building roads in hostile territory, designing surfaces that could handle 40-ton vehicles while maintaining stability in sand, mud, clay, and conditions that would make these suburban warriors cry. I'd supervised the construction of strategic highways that connected forward operating bases, airstrips that had to be operational within hours of clearing, and temporary bridges that carried convoys through mountain passes where one engineering miscalculation meant death. These people had chosen the wrong fight with the wrong person. I started with the county records office, where I pulled every document related to my property going back to its original subdivision in 1962. What I found was fascinating. The entire Maple Ridge development had been built on land that was originally designated as a state highway right-of-way reserve, held in trust for potential future road construction. The subdivision had been approved with the understanding that certain infrastructure elements, including access roads and drainage systems, had to meet state and federal highway specifications. My driveway wasn't just a driveway, it was part of the original traffic flow plan for a highway project that had been shelved in the 1970s, but never officially canceled. According to the Federal Highway Administration database, my property still carried an easement classification that required any paved surfaces to meet Department of Transportation standards for rural highway construction. The more I dug, the more interesting it got. I spent evenings at the municipal building, going through Planning Commission minutes, environmental impact studies, and Army Corps of Engineers flood control documents. My grandfather had taught me that when you're dealing with bullies, you don't fight them on their terms. You change the rules of the game. The HOA thought they were dealing with some retired soldier who didn't understand property law. They had no idea I'd spent years navigating federal regulations, state compliance requirements, and international construction standards in places where getting it wrong meant court-martial or congressional hearings. I documented everything, every email they ignored, every fine they levied, every threat they made. I photographed my driveway from every angle, showing its superior condition. Compared to the cracking concrete and deteriorating asphalt throughout the neighborhood, my wife started asking questions when she noticed me staying up late with stacks of government documents spread across the dining room table. "Are you going to tear up the driveway?" she asked one evening, watching me highlight sections of a 1973 Federal Highway Administration environmental assessment. I looked up from a particularly interesting paragraph about aggregate specifications and smiled. "Honey, they don't want me to tear up the driveway. They want me to upgrade it to federal highway standards." The look of confusion on her face was almost as satisfying as what I was planning for the HOA board. She didn't understand yet, but she would. By the time I was done, everyone would understand exactly what they'd stepped into. The breakthrough came when I found the original Army Corps of Engineers survey from 1962 buried in a box of documents at the state archives. The entire subdivision had been built on land purchased from the federal government under a specific clause that required all infrastructure to remain accessible for potential future federal transportation projects. My property, specifically, was designated as a critical access point for any future highway construction, which meant that any modifications to its surface or drainage systems had to be approved by the Federal Highway Administration. The HOA hadn't just violated their own grandfather clause, they'd violated federal law by attempting to force modifications to federally protected infrastructure without proper authorization. I made copies of everything and scheduled a meeting with the regional FHA office. The engineer who reviewed my case was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who listened to my explanation with growing interest. When I showed her the current condition of my driveway versus the HOA's demands, she shook her head and made some notes. In a file, "This is actually a textbook example of proper rural highway surfacing," she said, taking pictures of my documentation. "If someone forced you to replace this with standard concrete, it would actually violate federal specifications." She handed me a business card and told me she'd be in touch within 2 weeks with an official determination. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Federal Highway Administration had reviewed my case and determined that my gravel driveway was not only legally compliant, but was actually required to remain in its current configuration to meet federal infrastructure standards. Any attempt to force modifications without FHA approval would constitute interference with federal transportation infrastructure, which carried significant legal penalties. They were sending an official notice to the Maple Ridge HOA informing them that my property was under federal jurisdiction for transportation purposes and that any further harassment would be reported to the Department of Justice as a federal offense. Oh, and one more thing, since my driveway met federal highway standards. I was eligible for reimbursement of any maintenance costs as a contractor maintaining federally designated infrastructure. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center. I arrived early, took a seat in the back row, and waited. Martha Hendricks called the meeting to order and immediately announced that they needed to discuss the ongoing violation on Maple Ridge Drive. She began reading from her prepared statement about property values and community standards when I stood up and walked to the front of the room. The 20 or so neighbors in attendance turned to watch as I placed a manila folder on the table in front of the board. "Before you continue," I said quietly, "I think you should read this." Martha opened the folder, and her eyes went wide as she read the Federal Highway Administration letterhead. The other board members leaned in, and I watched their expressions change as they processed what they were seeing. The lawyer they'd brought along, the same kid who'd been sending me threatening letters, went completely pale as he read over their shoulders. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I continued. "My driveway is federally protected infrastructure. It's built to Army Corps of Engineers specifications for rural highway access, which is why it's lasted 40 years without major maintenance, while half the concrete driveways in this neighborhood are cracking and settling." I gestured toward the window, where my perfectly maintained gravel driveway was visible under the parking lot lights. "You've spent 3 months trying to find me for maintaining federal transportation infrastructure to Department of Transportation standards," I continued, keeping my voice level and professional. "According to the Federal Highway Administration, any further attempts to interfere with this infrastructure will be reported as a federal offense. The good news is that you don't have to worry about my driveway anymore. The bad news is that you're about to learn why you don't pick fights with military engineers." I let that sink in for a moment, watching as Martha frantically whispered with the lawyer, who was shaking his head and pointing at specific paragraphs in the FHA letter. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. The HOA dropped all fines and issued a written apology within a week, along with a commitment to review their violation policies to ensure compliance with federal regulations. Martha Hendricks resigned as president 2 months later, citing stress and health concerns. The lawyer they'd hired sent me a personal note, apologizing for the harassment and asking if I'd be interested in consulting on property law cases involving federal jurisdiction. The 3 board members who owned the preferred contractor companies suddenly found their services were no longer in demand as word spread about what had happened. My neighbors' attitudes changed overnight. The ones who'd been avoiding eye contact suddenly found reasons to stop and chat when they walked past my house. They asked questions about military engineering, federal property law, and how someone goes about learning to build roads that last decades instead of years. Some of them started asking for advice about their own HOA disputes and property issues. The gravel driveway that had been an eyesore became a conversation starter, symbol of practical engineering over aesthetic pretension. 6 months later, I received a check from the Federal Highway Administration for $3,200 reimbursement for materials and maintenance on federally designated transportation infrastructure. I used the money to install professional-grade LED lighting along the entire length of the driveway. with proper junction boxes and weather-resistant fixtures that met military specification for forward operating base perimeter lighting. It looks absolutely beautiful at night, and every time Martha Hendricks drives past on her way to her concrete driveway with its growing collection of cracks and oil stains, I know she's reminded of the lessons she learned about picking fights with people who build roads for a living. The best part is the quiet. My morning coffee on the back patio is peaceful again. My evenings in the workshop are undisturbed by legal threats, and the sound of my truck tires on gravel when I come home from fishing trips still reminds me of my grandfather's farm in Nebraska. The difference is that now, when I hear that sound, I also remember the look on a petty tyrant's face when she realized she'd declared war on the United States Department of Transportation. Some lessons are worth learning the hard way, and some roads are built to last longer than the people who try to tear them up.